So I'm here today at Siemens headquarters in the UK to talk to the UK boss, Jurgen Mayer, about some strong reasons why the UK should remain in the EU. So Jurgen Mayer, you're the boss of the UK division of a large global company with headquarters in Germany. So clearly your perspective is that Britain is better off in the EU. But can you see the perspective of a small British-owned company in the EU referendum debate?
Yeah, totally I can. And, very often the thing you hear is around overburdensome regulation. A couple of things I would say is that, first of all, we are a large manufacturer here in the UK with our 13 factories building a 14th. In our supply chain are lots of these small companies that you refer to. And I do totally understand that it can be a bit of a pain to have to comply to all of the same regulation that we large companies have to. But the fact is these companies are in our supply chain. We end up exporting the product somewhere else. So there is no choice but to comply to that regulation. So this sort of notion that we sometimes hear is that actually, only 5 or some say 10% of our manufacturers export. It's not really true because they're exporting through a larger company, and that's why they need to comply to the regulation. The other thing I would just say on regulation is that actually, whilst we don't like regulation, and by the way, we don't either in a large company like Siemens, but if you actually look at it, it is designed to improve the level playing field within which we operate, so therefore it creates fairer competition in markets across the EU, and it also drives up innovation in areas like environmental compliance, or it might be safety issues. So there's always, or generally, there is a very good reason why these things are happening. So it's always quick to criticise, but yeah.
You're referring mainly to regulation in terms of electronic engineering standards. But on another area of regulation, and forgive me, this isn't on my list, but if we look at something like HR and employment regulation, do you think small British companies have a case to say, actually, it would be less bureaucratic if we were an independent country outside the EU?
Well, again, sometimes we hear of this regulation, and recently there has been regulations about harmonised holiday days, for example, and you think, gosh, that's a bit of a pain. But then on the other hand, you think, well, isn't it fair that within a single trading market, we basically give the same sorts of conditions to all of the people who are working within that? And actually, when I often ask the question, and this is to small or large business, and I say, what sort of regulation that is coming out of Europe right now, which is a real pain for you and your employment? I mean, at the moment, that people will talk to you about is actually the living wage.
Right.
Now, that is not a European regulation. That's one that we created here in the United Kingdom. I'm not making a judgment it's good or bad. I actually think it's a good thing. But, it's not like all of this terrible stuff comes out of Europe. And usually, it's quite well thought through with regard to creating this level playing field. Sometimes Brussels gets it wrong, and clearly, as part of us remaining in the EU, one of the things we have to do is to push back at Brussels to make sure what they are doing is always thought through and really adding value to what we're trying to do in our industry.
You've got to be in it to amend it, sort of thing.
Well, and absolutely, yeah.
On trade, now, many people, both who are undecided and who wish to leave, have made the point that if the UK left the European Union, countries in the European Union will not stop trading with Britain overnight, or even over several months. It's not going to stop the trade. Can you express what will be different about trade if the UK were to leave?
Yeah, well, first of all, you are absolutely right. Trade would not stop overnight. There might be an issue where some tariffs are put on the trade. Some are saying not because, people will want to trade with us. But the real misunderstanding on this is not tariffs at all. Let's say tariffs went on our products to and fro between Europe. It would probably add somewhere between 3 and 5%. I mean, that's large, but it's not the most significant. The much more significant issue is that what we would see is an erosion of the standards that have been created across the EU, and disadvantages, barriers would start coming in the way for British exporters by way of the things we call non-tariff barriers. Now, there has been several estimates done, and that is that all of these non-tariff barriers, which is creating a level playing field, has actually reduced the burden and cost of manufacturers in the UK by at least 20%. So we're comparing 20% to 3%. Now that 20% wouldn't rise overnight. It would be a slow creep-in process over a period of time. And just to put a few facts on that, we had a quick look at the sort of standards that affect our 13 factories here in the UK. And if you go to before the single market, there was around 160,000 national pieces of regulation that we and similar industries would have needed to comply to send a different standard for Italy, France, etc., etc. Today, those standards, because we normally harmonise and would create out of 28 national standards one single EU standard, today we have to comply to 19,000 standards. You imagine the improvement in productivity that we can create in our factories as a result of that.
Impressive numbers. I suppose one could say, though, that your factory, certainly in Congleton, springs to mind, makes motor drives. It's quite a complicated piece of equipment, and it's going to have to comply with many different types of standards across the EU member nations. But companies that make simpler components, do you think the parallel can be drawn that regulation is also, standard regulation is being reduced for those simpler parts as well, by being a member of the EU?
Yeah, no, and you are right, that can be an issue, so if it is a less complex part, then, applying that same level of regulation might be an issue. And this is where, sometimes we have to push back and work with Brussels to say, look, let's do regulation where really it creates an advantage. Although a point that's also worth making is that very often the simpler parts end up in a product which is more complicated. So it has no choice but to actually have the same standard.
Yeah. Now, among other roles, Jurgen, you are, I believe, an advisor to BIS, the Department for Business, Innovation and Skills, on manufacturing. So you've got a very good handle on the nuances and the issues to manufacturers across the piece, not just in electronic engineering or indeed other types of industrial engineering that Siemens does, but you've got a handle on food and drink, textiles, oil and gas, the whole caboose. So my question is, if you were to simplify 3 strong reasons for companies to remain in the EU, but right across the board for different types of manufacturing, what would those 3 principles be?
Well, I think the first is definitely access to this single market. And don't forget, this is not just about tariffs. Much more important is the standardisation and is the fact that we've got a level playing field, it's harmonised and it's easier to do business within it. So that's point number 1. Point number 2 is very important that we have influence on what those standards and regulation are going to be. Yeah, I mean, as far as Siemens is concerned, we can have influence on those from within Germany, from within France or whatever. But my job here in the UK is to make sure that the 13 factories we have here, that we're influencing and making sure the standards that are set are useful and are helping the factory here in the UK to remain, to be prosperous, to be able to grow. So influence is the second point. And the third point, very important, is that a lot of the R&D programs we're involved with are pretty large programs. And by the way, I want to point out they're large, but ultimately with lots of opportunities for small, innovative startup companies to get involved with. But the programs of a scale for developing the future of driverless cars, how we're putting electric hybrid propulsion onto future aircraft. These are massive R&D programs, and no single European country, not even Germany, has got the clout, has got the bandwidth to fund all of that. So we need to collaborate together to make sure we're competing against the other 2 major blocks, which are the USA and China. And the better we do that collaboratively, and the more influence we have on that, the more of that industry we can bring to the United Kingdom and create jobs and prosperity in those industries here.
But Jurgen, with all these standards and regulations that one has to face, particularly as an SME in the EU, Surely this is a good reason for many people to question whether it's worth remaining in the EU.
Yeah, and I do fully understand that if you're a small engineering company, all of this regulation, it seems a bit much that you have to conform to. But what we need to remember is that what all of this regulation is designed to do is to create a level playing field, in many areas a pretty high standard. A standard of very high environmental compliance, in other words, energy efficient products that we within Europe have to comply to. And what that is also designed to do is to make sure that the consumer is sure that when he's buying a product, it has that standard. Now, if we suddenly let all of that regulation drop down and we say we're going to do less of it, nice, less bureaucracy for a small company. But what it means is we now allow in competition from China, which is fine, but it's bringing it in at a non-level playing field. In other words, products don't have the same standards. And there is a report by the Leave campaign written by Patrick Minford. It's a very good report. It actually says that prices will come down if we drop this regulation. Absolutely right. What he also rightly points out is that this would eliminate British manufacturing, and that would ultimately be a result of just dropping our standards on all of this European regulation.
So really the regulation argument is it protects our interests because it keeps prices high and competitive where companies can make a profit.
Well, it's not just, it's not about keeping prices high. I mean, actually it allows us to innovate, but it means that we're giving the consumer absolute certainty that what he's buying is what it says on the tin. It's a high standard, high safety standard, high environmental standard, and the consumer is protected from imports that wouldn't meet those same levels of regulation.
Well, Jurgen Mayer, CEO of Siemens in the UK, thank you very much.
Thank you.